Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me clearly? Great. Okay. So, first of all, I'd like to say it's a great privilege for me to be here. We are the sponsor of the event, but specifically for me to speak here at the university has always been an exceptional dream and desire and an aspiration for me. So, thank you all for coming specifically to this talk. I'd like to say that I was asked to speak about the power of an humanities degree. And I think to some degree, I guess it is appropriate for me to speak about this. Whereas often I am asked to speak about topics that it's somewhat inappropriate for me to speak about, or at least I'm not qualified to speak about. This is one topic that I've never spoken about before, and I would say that I'm uniquely perhaps qualified to do so. So, on a personal note, I matriculated in 1989. So I grew up in apartheid South Africa in a world in which there was riots coming up the hill here at UCT, and there were protests, and there was a lot going on that we didn't fully understand in South Africa. And coming out of the education system that I came out of, we didn't necessarily know what was going on. I had it in my head that I wanted to be a paramedic, and I wanted to go to the Angolan border to fight the Cubans and be a paramedic. And my father felt very strongly that I should go to university rather than going to the military. It was a time when I didn't apply to the university, and he managed to bring me down here. And the compromise was that instead of studying something vocational, such as finance or engineering, that I would study what I wanted to study. And what I wanted to study was mathematics. If I was not going to be a paramedic or in the military, I would study mathematics. And because mathematics has got no prerequisites, so when you study finance or corporate finance or engineering, you would have to do a number of courses, one of which may be mathematics. When you study mathematics, it's one lecture a day, and you can study whatever else you want. So I, under BSc, was studying English literature, psychology, applied mathematics, physics, and mathematics, which were the subjects I wanted to study. At the end of the day, I ended up getting a BSc, and then I did a BA English honors, and I was fortunate enough to do an MLit, a Master's in Literature, at the University of Cape Town with J.M. Coetzee. He was at that time a very famous South African writer. He was at that time in residence at UCT, and he was teaching classes, and I wanted more than I wanted anything else to study under J.M. Coetzee, who I regarded as an incredible teacher and a great novelist. So I then complete my master's degree, and I could not find a job, and I really struggled. And in this way, I think it is appropriate that I speak about the power of a humanities degree, because there are certain things that I've learned along the way that you could not have learned if you had not had the tortuous path that I decided to take. I went from job to job, and some jobs were more satisfying than others, but it took me a very long time to get to where I wanted to be, which was in a position where I'd learned enough to start my company, which is Monocle, and which I now own with my fellow owners, some of whom are in this room right now. I did study later on a CFA, which is a Chartered Financial Analyst, and that really helped. So how do I now justify to you the power of an humanities degree? How can I make my case? So I want to first of all I want to make some very fundamental points. The first is this: in a society as unequal as ours is, if you are smart enough and you work hard enough and you're privileged enough and you have sufficient funding, to go to tertiary education in the first place, and you choose then not to study a vocationally led degree, one that semi-guarantees a good job, such as a Bachelor of Business Science or Finance or something like engineering. So if you've made the decision, after all the work and effort and sacrifices that have been made by others and by yourself, and then you decide to study something like Italian or something like history, then you are very different to other people. And you form a special group of people, which are those who study humanities degrees, the classic humanities degrees, literature, linguistics, English, arts, history. Those people are special because they vocationally have already decided that they would like to learn for the sake of it. So the first point I want to make in argument for a humanities degree is the peers that you choose to be with and those that are around you are by definition specifically different to others, and they will be somewhat more discerning in what they study, and they're studying for the sake of it. They wish to learn for the sake of it. That is not to disparage any other degree, but I'm saying I need to make a very difficult case, which is for a humanities degree, and this is part of my case. The second point I want to make is that to a large degree, to a large extent, there is some validity in Arthur Caplan's theory, what we call signal theory. So there's a researcher called Arthur Caplan who has written a book called Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. And it was published in 2017, and it's a very controversial book published in the US, and he's used statistical data, statistical analysis, and data analysis to argue that 80% of the meaning and of the significance of the degree that you get in the US is the signal of the degree, meaning the conferring of the degree at the end that you are degreed, and not the learning that you get from the degree. And he gives evidence, for example, in South Korea, something like 70% of people between the age of 24 and 35, if I recall, have a degree, have a tertiary degree of the entire South Korean population. So that when I am now looking for staff to join my firm, and I'm looking at the South Korean population, how do I distinguish between one person and another when 70% of the population has a degree? In a world in which that is the case, so let us for a second agree with Arthur Caplan that the value of a degree is substantially the signal. In a world in which that's the case, I make a strong case that we should be even more focused on making sure that what we're learning and what we are learning is the time that we're spending at a university is significantly valuable to us. I've noticed also, another point I'd like to make, I've noticed also that there is a new trend in the vocational degrees. For example, in finance, Bachelor of Business Science, engineering even, where they're bolting on topics such as strategic thinking, critical thinking, mindfulness. Someone must tell me what mindfulness is one day. Mindfulness. my daughter, who's at school, is being taught something called mindfulness. These bolt-on topics, strategic thinking, critical thinking, are attempts by the vocational degrees, the vocational faculties, to meet the gap that exists in the fact that people may have topic knowledge, such as the capital asset pricing model, but they don't necessarily know how to communicate, interpret, assess, think. Whereas I would argue that in a humanities degree, it is not a bolt-on topic. It is the entire point of the degree. When you're studying literature, or when you're studying art history or history, from the beginning to the end, the assumption is that you are going to read and read and read and read until your understanding of the world, but more so your understanding of your own mind and your critical faculties, is such that you're able to have the right to now read some more and assess some more. For me, this came to my understanding through my reading of Russian literature, and it's a great privilege to be able to do what I'm about to do, which is I'm going to read to you from Tolstoy, from Leo Tolstoy, and I'm going to do that in an effort to help you understand what it is that I'm trying to say. I'm experiencing some challenges. Just give me a second. So, Leo Tolstoy wrote a book called War and Peace. He also wrote Anna Karenina. Leo Tolstoy is perhaps the greatest writer who's ever graced us over the thousands of years. A friend of mine who's a great writer said to me that once he had read War and Peace, he felt that it was so good that it made it clear that Tolstoy must have been from another species, never mind from another planet. So Tolstoy wrote a book called War and Peace, and it's just a really, really, really good book. And in that book, there's a character called Rostov who basically is an aristocrat. Remember, this is before the Russian Revolution. And Rostov is in the Battle of Austerlitz, which is fought between the Russian Emperor Alexander I and his troops, the Russian troops, to defend the Russian Empire against the advances being made by Napoleon and his troops. And we are inside the characters on the Russian side, and Rostov is now, the battle's been lost, and Rostov's been sent to give a message to Alexander, but he's heard that Alexander's been killed by cannon fire. The emperor has been killed by cannon fire. So I'm going to read to you. You're going to take 2 minutes. It's worth it. It's worth listening to this. So, he had ridden for a couple of miles, passing the last of the Russian troops, when he came to a kitchen garden enclosed by a ditch. 2 men on horseback stood facing the ditch. One of them had a white plume in his hat, and Rostov fancied he had seen him before. The other man was a stranger on a fine chestnut. In his case, it was the horse that looked familiar. He rode up to the ditch, gave his horse a touch of the spurs, loosened the reins, and jumped easily across into the garden, disturbing nothing but a little earth that crumbled down from the bank under the horse's hind hooves. Turning the horse sharply, he jumped back over the ditch and made a respectful approach to the horseman with the white plume, as if inviting him to do the same. Rostov was suddenly fascinated by the rider, whose general appearance had struck him as familiar, and when this man made a gesture of refusal with his head and his hand, Rostov instantly recognized his idolized and much lamented sovereign. No, it can't be. Not him on his own in the middle of this empty field, thought Rostov. At that moment, Alexander turned his head, and Rostov caught sight of the beloved features so sharply etched into his memory. The Tsar was pale, his cheeks looked haggard, and his eyes hollow. But this made his features look even more charming and gentle. Rostov was delighted to discover that the rumor about the emperor being wounded was untrue. He was delighted to see him. Now was his chance. Indeed, it was his duty to go straight up to him and deliver the message entrusted to him by Dolgorukov. But just as a lovelorn youth dithers and freezes, too scared to force out the words he has dreamt about for nights on end, panics and looks around for help or any chance of delay and escape, now that the longed-for moment is here and he and she are alone together. So Rostov, suddenly presented with what he wanted most of all in the world, had no idea how to approach the emperor, and his mind was assailed by thousands of reasons why it would be wrong, inconvenient, and impossible to do so. No, it would be like taking advantage of him when he's alone and despondent. It might be unpleasant and painful for him to see an unfamiliar face when he's suffering like that. When I read that, it changed me forever. I was completely different after reading that. And it wasn't because I read just that page. Obviously, it's 1,000 pages, the book. And I've read lots of Russian literature, read Dostoevsky. And to fully absorb that moment and to experience that epiphany of understanding that Rostov had failed, not because he's a failure, and not in any way that I can actually find words for. You have to be Tolstoy to actually explain it. And it can't be explained. But it is the failure of being human. There's something fundamentally built into us, whether you have religious convictions or not religious convictions, or no matter what your belief system is. You have to admit, if you've read thousands of pages of Russian literature, that you will experience this epiphany and it will change you forever. And I remember looking up from the book as if people would have noticed that I'd changed, like my hair would have gone green or orange, and that I would be fundamentally different. But I realized that nothing had actually changed, and in fact I had not changed, and nothing had changed, but my mind had been blown up, because I now understood that there's some Rostov in all of us, and that I had had my Rostov moments. I had been the dithering youth, but not only in that way, I had also done it in my career. I had not stood up when I was supposed to stand up and when the moment best presented itself. And I had not been bold. And I had idolized and I had imagined for thousands of hours how I would act. And then when the time came, I did not act in the way that was necessary. And I had justified it to myself and made my excuses. And I had failed myself because I'm human. And once I understood that, I had some more love of myself and I had more empathy for myself. And this is something that I would say you can only learn in an humanities degree, or if you are presented, for example, with peers that are all reading Russian literature, as we all were. We were almost in a race to read all the great literature pieces before each other, because our peers were doing it, because it was what we were doing. Inside great literature is contained these incredible epiphanies of meaning that you cannot put into words, and that you can't teach in sound bites, and that you cannot bolt on to other faculties. And it is not necessarily going to be easier for you as a humanities student to get a job, but it's going to be different for you because you're going to have insights and experiences and epiphanies that others may not. And you should encourage others to read. I have also sorry, just catching up. I've also got another point I'd like to make is, do you know, when I grew up, there was grade 1, and then grade 2, and then standard 1, standard 2, standard 10, post-matric. I didn't do post-matric. I came straight to university, as you know, and I then flailed around for many years, not wanting to leave the university. But basically, in short, with the introduction in schooling of grade 0, and then grade 00 and grade 000. Actually, we're talking about from the age of 3 to the age of, say you do a master's degree, 25, 20 to 24 years of your life is spent basically in institutionalized learning in one form or another to prepare you for work, where you somehow in what I find, what I regard to be the most inefficient process. And one of the reasons I love UCT and the UCT careers office is they get it. They get that this is a really inefficient process where people are expected to suddenly vocationally jump into a job. And people who've studied and excelled and done brilliantly then go and work in a company where they're in a call center, or they have that, they pinch themselves and go, is this it? Is this what it's all about? And that happens not just in one job or another job, it happens in all jobs. Because to a large extent, the problem is not that the universities are not preparing people for the world of work. The problem is that the world of work is not interacting with the universities, but more so than either of those. The problem is that we are not sufficiently understanding the meaning of work. And we're not understanding that we are made what we are by our actions. We are made what we are by the way that we love. We are made that we are by the way that we work. And if you want vocationally to be an investment banker or a trader or a doctor, you must be very careful, I would argue, that that's all that you become. That your mind and that your sense of being is not too enraptured with that vocation. You are supposed to learn for the sake of learning, and you're supposed to do that so that you can experience the joy of the epiphany of understanding. I want to talk about I want to give an example of about how I might think slightly differently, or how someone who has had to write thousands of pages of essays on, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn might think slightly differently. So I was watching the Ashes, which is a cricket match between Australia and England, in which England was being destroyed. And there was a advertisement break, and it was for the rugby, the international rugby, because we're about to, we're in the Tri-Nations, or the Four Nations at the moment. And in this international rugby, they were promoting the Beast, Tararira the Beast. And he he says, when I was 14, I was watching a game, and I just wanted to become an international rugby player. I was inspired, and I wanted to become an international rugby player. And they were promoting, therefore, this idea that the Beast dreamed of becoming an international rugby player. And because he dreamed it, it came true. And I thought to myself that every single rugby player who plays international rugby would say that there was a moment in time when they dreamed of becoming an international rugby player. Because they're very unlikely to say, I dreamed of becoming a neurosurgeon, but I was sidetracked because I was really good at rugby. And now, look, I'm an international rugby player. I've never, ever heard an international rugby player say that. And in fact, we're making an enormous error of logic if we take the Beast seriously. Because actually, the opposite is true, which is that not only does everyone who plays international rugby say that they dreamed of becoming an international rugby player, they also are ignoring the fact that there are thousands of young men that are not going to become international rugby players, who wish to become international rugby players, whose only dream it is. As there are thousands of people who, for example, want to become basketball players. And in fact, this is a very dangerous notion, and it's one of the problems that we face in this Western world of ours, in which we are, to some extent, on this like little rats, like running around on a treadmill. We just train ourselves, so that we can work, so that we can retire. And we are using our heroes like the beast, and we project this idea of this being a dreamable venture. And because the beast dreamed it harder than someone else dreamed it, it becomes true for him. And we ignore the rest of the meaning of our lives. I wanted to become a fire engine driver, but I was a child, and I thought then as a child. And at some point, I must think as an adult. As an adult, I must recognize that in the world, there are people who struggle, there's inequality, and we will make our way in the world, and we will meet our loved ones, and we will be, hopefully we will be happy if we strive for meaning in our lives. And if we compartmentalize work and we put it aside, and if we don't do anything but do the work, if we don't feel the work, and we don't seek meaning in our work, and whatever work that may be, then we will be empty, because more than 2/3 of our waking hours will be wasted on something that does nothing but pay the bills. We must seek meaning in our work. I would argue that whereas, of course, it will be easier to get a job if you've studied finance or engineering, if you've studied an humanities degree, and if you've really read and enjoyed that degree, I would say that you'll be more disposed to be able to find meaning in your lives. And this is the lesson that we should teach those who've not had the privilege that I've had of studying a humanities degree. I get to do this thing this is amazing. I'm about to recite a poem to you. Isn't that great? Yes. Okay. So this poem is written by Derek Walcott. Derek Walcott is a Caribbean writer. He was much maligned by the press, accused of many bad things, much hated by certain parties, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Not everyone's favorite. That's not relevant. The point is, I'm going to read this poem, and I get to do so because I've been asked to speak on the power of a humanities degree, and I can't think of a better way than reading you guys a poem. I want you to listen very carefully, and then we'll speak about this poem. We have the time. We have the time. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back to your heart, to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit. Feast on your life. So what do you think of that poem? This is a poem written by Derek Walcott that's been very meaningful to me. When I was at university and when I was in the early years of my career, it was very important that I was either going out to meet people of interest to me, to bars and restaurants, taking, my friends were feeling the same. We were all seeking our life partners. We were all seeking people that we could connect with. And then sometimes our hearts were broken. And I would say this occupies a lot of our time, even when we're at work. And here Derek Walcott is saying, there is a moment where you can feel that pain, but then you must have the strength to recognize that the person who should love you the most and that you should love the most is in fact yourself. And this is something that takes thousands of hours of reading to find. But there's something else in here and I'm not a religious man, but I want to ask you if you can see it. The language he uses, it's very subtle, but it's there. And these are the critical faculties that you can use in your life. Does anyone see it? There's something else very strong coming through. It's the Last Supper. The Last Supper the language is biblical. Why does Derek Walcott use such biblical language? And we must remember also that Derek Walcott is writing from the Caribbean stage, where black men and women do not occur there for any other reason than slavery. And they were given the Bible, and that is the language of the gospel. That is the language with which people speak. Sit, feast on your life. And if we think like that, if we see the way that language speaks through us, it gives us a much deeper understanding of how we should speak to people, but most importantly, of how we should assess our own language and the way that we speak to the world and to ourselves. Thank you very much for listening to me.